The chamber of the Grand Conclave had never been built for silence. It had been built for ceremony, for the grand processional of 43 elder species, for the slow ritual of deliberation, for the comfortable theater of power. The ceiling alone was 300 meters above the polished obsidian floor, carved from a single asteroid, and etched with the names of every species the Council had ever admitted, welcomed, or expelled. There were 11 names in the expulsion column. Humanity was about to become the 12th. Ambassador Mara Osai stood at the single lectern reserved for the accused. She was 44 years old. She had spent 12 of those years preparing for this moment. She wore no ceremonial dress, no alien-approved diplomatic sash, no translation collar around her throat. She had memorized the Council's own 17 dialects well enough to speak each one without aid. That choice alone had caused a murmur when she entered. The Veth delegate, a towering creature of gray cartilage and slow, luminescent eyes, had leaned to his aid and whispered something. Mara had understood it perfectly. She had not reacted. High Arbiter Sarath of the Soral Dominion read the charges. Humanity was accused of 17 violations: unauthorized colonization of disputed stellar territory, armed resistance against Council inspection fleets, contamination of 2 protected trade corridors, and the charge that carried the most weight: refusal to accept species rank classification. In the Council's framework, a civilization was assigned a rank based on age, technological threshold, and demonstrated deference to elder species. Humanity, barely 3 centuries into interstellar space, had been offered rank 17. They had declined. They had, in the words of the formal charge, laughed. Mara waited until Sarath finished. Then she spoke. Not loudly, the acoustics of the chamber were such that a whisper carried to every corner, but with the deliberate weight of someone who had already decided the outcome, did not matter as much as the record. This council, she said in the Soral primary tongue, was founded on the principle that no species is sovereign over another. I have read your founding charter. I have read it in all 11 of your original languages. Article 1, Clause 3. All spacefaring civilizations retain the right of self-determination, free from coercion by any body, including this one. She paused. You are not expelling us for our crimes. You are expelling us because we read your own rules and declined to pretend. They did not apply to us. The vote took 4 minutes. It was 42-1. The single dissent came from the Pelari Accord, a small species of 6-limbed mathematicians who had joined the Council only 19 years prior. Their delegate, barely taller than a human child, met Mara's eyes as the tally was read. She gave him a small nod. He returned it. High Arbiter Sarath announced the terms. The Sol Gate, the only Council-recognized transit junction connecting human space to the wider galaxy, would be sealed with a binding lattice. No human vessel would be granted passage. No human signal would be relayed through Council networks. Earth and its colonies would be excised from all Council charts. Officially, from this day forward, humanity did not exist. Sarath's voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone delivering a sentence they had written themselves. Mara Osai listened to every word. She did not protest. She did not weep. When Sarath finished, she gathered her single leather folio, an affectation she had kept deliberately because no elder species used paper, and she found the confusion it caused deeply enjoyable, and she walked toward the chamber doors. One of the Kreth guards moved to block her path. She stopped, looked at him, and said quietly in his own dialect, "Move, I am leaving voluntarily. There is a difference, remember that." He moved. She did not look back at the chamber. There was nothing there worth the effort. The interesting part, she had already decided, was going to happen later. From the outside, the Sol system went dark within a decade. The binding lattice sealed the gate cleanly. The Soral engineers who designed it had built 17 before, and they were justifiably proud of their work. No human ship crossed the threshold. No human broadcast penetrated the lattice's signal dampening. On Council charts, the small yellow star at coordinates 0 simply ceased to be labeled. Cartographers marked it as inert. The Council moved on. It had 42 other species to manage, and humanity had seemed, in the end, so very small. They were not thinking about what silence can be used for. In the first 20 years after the exile, there was grief on Earth. That surprised some people and surprised nobody who had been paying attention. Humans are a species that rages against loss. They always have been, from the moment the first of them looked at a cold fire and decided to make it burn again. The grief was real. Colonies that had been building trade relationships watched their economies hollow out overnight. Scientists who had been sharing research with alien institutions found their collaborative networks severed. Children born in the year of the exile grew up knowing only stories of a wider galaxy they were forbidden to reach. But grief in humans has a short half-life. What replaces it is usually more dangerous. Commander Elias Varro was 40 years old when the gate closed. He was a third-generation spacer, born on the colony of Kepler's Rest, a rocky world orbiting a dim orange star 4 light-years from Sol. He had spent his career flying council-approved trade routes, submitting to council inspections, and watching alien customs officers treat his crew like a possible contamination risk rather than people. When the exile came, his first feeling was fury. His second feeling, which arrived 3 weeks later, while he was sitting alone in his cockpit staring at the lattice wall on his long-range sensors, was something cleaner. It was possibility. "They've locked us in a box," he told his crew that night over a meal that nobody was really eating. "But it's our box. Every star system within 400 light-years of Sol that isn't council-claimed. Every resource deposit they never bothered to survey because they didn't think we were worth competing with. Every physics problem we asked them about, and they answered with a pat on the head and a ranking reminder." He set down his fork. "They handed us a laboratory and told us it was a prison." That speech, or a version of it, was being given by roughly 40,000 other humans at roughly the same moment across 12 colonies and one home world. The specific words differed. The direction was the same. Dr. Eunicio was 26, a physicist at the Ganymede Institute when the exile was declared. She had been 3 months from presenting her doctoral thesis on what she privately called lattice resonance, the theoretical behavior of the energy fields used in binding lattices. Her advisor had urged her to shelve the research. "The council won't like it," he had said. "They consider lattice science proprietary." After the exile, there was no longer any reason to care what the council liked. She finished the thesis in 6 weeks. Then she started on the next question, not how lattices worked, but how they could be taken apart. 212 years would pass before the outside galaxy heard from humanity again. In the Council's archives, those years were recorded as a humanitarian tragedy. A young species, cut off from civilization, presumably declining toward internal conflict and eventual extinction. The archivists were thorough and well-meaning. They were also catastrophically wrong. Silence is not the same as stillness. They had mistaken one for the other. It was the most expensive mistake in galactic history. The Terran Compact was not born in a single moment. It was assembled across 2 centuries the way great things usually are, badly at first, then better, then with a confidence that comes only from having failed enough times to know what failure looks like before it arrives. There were wars in the early decades. Of course there were. Humans without an external enemy had a well-documented tendency to create internal ones. But those wars ended. That was the part the Council had miscalculated. The wars ended not because humanity was conquered into peace, but because the cost became obvious to enough people at once. 3 generations of children had grown up hearing the same story. The galaxy is out there, and we are not in it yet, and the only thing between us and that galaxy is each other's stupidity. It turned out to be a compelling argument. By the 80-year mark, the Terran Compact had unified 9 of humanity's 12 inhabited systems under a single governing framework. Not an empire in the old sense. There was no emperor, no hereditary throne, no conquered underclass. It was closer to a federation with a long memory and a very clear purpose. Every election, every infrastructure project, every research grant had to answer the same question. Does this bring us closer, or does it waste what little time we have? The question had a way of cutting through politics rather efficiently. The terraforming program was the first thing that would have astonished an outside observer. The Council had shared terraforming technology with humanity early, partly as a goodwill gesture, mostly as a way of keeping human colonies contained to worlds already deemed livable, and therefore non-threatening. What they had not anticipated was what happens when you give a resourceful species a set of tools, and then leave them alone with those tools for 200 years. By year 90, Terran engineers had developed 5 terraforming techniques the Council had never conceived of. By year 140, they had turned 3 previously uninhabitable worlds into functioning biospheres in under a decade each. The Council's best time for a comparable project was 60 years. But terraforming was, in the end, merely impressive. What Dr. Seo's descendants built in the physics laboratories of Ganymede was something else entirely. It was called the resonance theorem, a complete mathematical description of the energy architecture underlying binding lattices, extended into a broader theory of what humans began calling structural spacetime. The short version was this: the Council had discovered how to lock doors. Humanity had figured out the nature of doors. The difference was not small. From the resonance theorem came 17 new branches of applied physics, 2 of which produced propulsion systems that made Council standard drives look like steam engines, and one of which, the one that remained classified at the highest level for the first 50 years of its existence, described, in precise and testable steps, exactly how to dissolve a binding lattice from the inside. Fleet Admiral Dale Osai was the great-great-great-granddaughter of Ambassador Mara Osai. She had grown up with the portrait of her ancestor in the hallway of her family home on New Carthage, a small colony world that had been a frozen rock when Mara was born, and was now a temperate, breathing world of 400 million people. The portrait showed Mara as she had looked leaving the Grand Conclave. Chin level, folio under one arm, nothing on her face that could be called defeat. Dale had looked at that portrait every morning of her childhood. She had decided, at age 7, that she wanted to be the person who finished what her ancestor had started. 40 years of service later, she stood on the bridge of the TCS unyielding premise, flagship of a fleet of 40,000 warships, and looked at the long-range sensors showing the faint shimmer of the binding lattice around the Sol Gate. "Ma'am," her tactical officer said, "lattice dissolution team confirms ready." Dale thought about the portrait. She thought about the 11 other names in the expulsion column at the Grand Conclave. She thought about a small, six-limbed delegate who had voted no when everyone else voted yes, and who had probably never been thanked for it. "Open the Sol Gate," she said. The lattice dissolved in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. It had stood for 212 years. It came apart like it had never been anything more than mist. The Council patrol vessel Serenity of Veth was on a routine survey run along the outer boundary of the Orith corridor when its sensors registered something that should have been impossible. The binding lattice at Sol coordinate was gone. Not damaged, gone. The energy signature that had been a constant fixture in this region of space for over 2 centuries had simply ceased to exist, and in the space where it had been, a fleet of ships was emerging. Captain Riensorel had been in service for 30 years. She had seen pirates, rogue colony ships, derelict freighters, and once an unprecedented gamma burst that had taken 3 years off her life expectancy and several seconds off her reaction time. She had never seen anything like what her sensors were now showing her. She counted the contacts. She counted them again. She sent the number to her first officer with a note that said simply, "Check my math." He checked it, he sent it back. The number was the same. 40,000 ships. Not 40,000 small ships. 40,000 warships, ranging from vessels the size of a Council heavy cruiser to something at the center of the formation that her sensor suite couldn't fully resolve, because it was the size of a small moon and apparently moving under its own power. Riensorel was a professional. She opened a standard hail on the Council emergency frequency and identified herself. She informed the incoming fleet that they were operating in sealed space designated under the Sol exclusion order, and that they were required to halt and submit to inspection. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that afterward. The response came in perfect Sorel primary dialect. The voice was calm, unhurried, and slightly warm, the tone of someone addressing a minor administrative matter. Captain Rien Sorrel, we are the Terran Compact, operating under Council Charter Article 1, Clause 3, right of transit for all spacefaring civilizations. We are aware of the Sol Exclusion Order. We note that its legal basis, the Council's claimed authority to unilaterally suspend charter rights, was challenged at the time of its issuance and never resolved by formal arbitration. We are proceeding to the transit corridor. You are welcome to follow at a safe distance and observe that we intend no hostile action. Rien Sorrel fired a warning shot. She had standing orders to do so in the event of unauthorized transit, and she followed her orders. The bolt of focused plasma, enough energy to crack a city block, struck the lead human vessel's forward shield array and scattered like water hitting a wall. The human ship did not alter course. Its shields did not even fluctuate on her sensors. They had simply absorbed the impact and moved on, with the faint air of something that had not noticed. She called for reinforcements. Then she followed at a safe distance, because she was a professional, and because some instinct she trusted more than her training told her that following was the correct choice. The reinforcements arrived 4 hours later. A Veth battle group of 30 ships, commanded by Admiral Horeth Veth, a decorated veteran who had never lost an engagement and was not expecting to lose one today. He reviewed the sensor data on his approach. He reviewed it again. He hailed the human fleet and received the same polite, documented, charter-sighting response. He positioned his ships across the transit corridor and transmitted an ultimatum: halt or be fired upon. The human fleet halted. Dale Osai's image appeared on his communications screen. She was younger than he expected. She was wearing a uniform without rank insignia, a human custom. He would later learn among their senior command, the idea being that rank should be obvious from conduct, not badges. "Admiral," she said, "we have transmitted our legal position to the Council Emergency Network. We have also transmitted a complete technical report on the dissolution of the Sol binding lattice, including the mathematical framework, so that you will understand it was not a weapon but a key. We have no wish to fight you, but we will not stop." Horeth Veth gave the order to fire. Full battery. Every ship in his group opened on the human fleet simultaneously. When the energy dispersed, the human ships were still there, still moving. Not one had returned fire. Horeth Veth sat in his command chair for a very long moment. Then he did something he had never done in 30 years of command. He ordered a withdrawal. Not a retreat, he was careful about the word. A withdrawal. There was a difference, and he suspected he would be explaining it to the Council for the rest of his career. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 48 hours after the Sol Gate incident. The chamber that had once sentenced humanity to silence was now filled with the particular noise of institutions that have encountered something they were not prepared for. Delegates spoke over each other. Translators struggled to keep pace. The High Arbiter's attempts to impose order were largely ignored. The Veth hegemony's representative, a younger, angrier descendant of the delegate who had voted for exile 2 centuries prior, stood on the floor for 11 minutes demanding a declaration of total war before he was finally persuaded to sit down. What the Council eventually agreed on was not war. It was a coalition enforcement action, a designation that meant the same thing as war but required fewer votes and generated less paperwork. The Veth hegemony, the Sorrel Dominion, and the Kreth Collective pooled their fleets, 412 warships, the largest combined military force the Council had assembled in 60 years. They were sent to the Orith Corridor with orders to stop the Terran Compact by whatever means necessary. The Battle of the Orith Corridor began at 3:40 Council Standard Time and ended at 14:27, 11 hours and 47 minutes. Later, military historians, most of them human, some of them from the smaller Council species who had watched with quiet and increasingly hopeful attention, would analyze the battle in detail. What they found, consistently, was that it was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration. The Terran fleet, outnumbered more than 10-1 in ship count, engaged the coalition with what could only be described as surgical deliberateness. Every human action was recorded. Every engagement was proportional. When a Sorrel ship was disabled rather than destroyed, it was not an accident. It was a choice, made in the middle of combat because the humans had calculated that disabling served the objective as well as destroying, and destroying was unnecessary. Commander Pel Darat of the Kreth Collective watched his fleet's left flank dissolve in the third hour of the battle and made a decision he would spend the rest of his life defending. He pulled his ships back and opened a comm channel to the nearest human vessel. "We are withdrawing from engagement," he said. "We are not surrendering. We are withdrawing." The human response came within seconds. "Acknowledged, Commander. Your withdrawal corridor is clear. Safe passage." He stared at that message for a long time. By the 11th hour, the Veth and Sorrel forces had lost 248 ships, destroyed, disabled, or captured. The Terran Compact had lost 4, not 400, 4, and every human crew of a disabled ship had been recovered before the Terran fleet moved on. No human life was left behind. No enemy crew member was fired upon after disabling. No civilian installation within 10 light minutes was touched. The Terran fleet continued to the Orith Transit Junction without pause. It docked. It resupplied from its own logistics chain, which had been following at a distance so calm and organized that the Council's observation ships had initially mistaken it for a civilian convoy. Then it continued inward, toward Council core space, at exactly the speed it had been traveling before the battle started. Admiral Dale Ose filed a formal post-engagement report with the Council Emergency Network within 6 hours of the battle's end. It was thorough, accurate, and included a precise accounting of every action taken and its legal justification under Council Charter. It also included a medical assessment of every captured coalition crew member, all of whom were in good health, and a formal request for information on where to transfer them. High Arbiter Sareth III, grandson of the man who had exiled humanity, read that report in his private chambers at what he privately considered the worst moment of his career. It was not the military loss that frightened him. Military losses could be recovered from. What frightened him was the report's tone. It was the tone of a civilization that was not angry, not triumphant, not afraid. It was patient. That was the word he kept returning to, profoundly, immovably patient, as if they had all the time in the universe and had decided, for reasons of their own, to spend some of it here. The Council had 43 member species. Of those 43, 11 were what the internal governance structure termed elder races, civilizations that had been spacefaring for more than 5,000 years, and held the majority of Council votes, most of the senior arbitration seats, and all 5 permanent positions on the High Chamber. The remaining 32 species had a combined vote share of 28%. This arrangement had been in place for so long that most of the smaller species had stopped noticing how unusual it was. It had simply become the shape of things. The way water has a shape in a given container, not because water chose it, but because the container was there first. Reith Pelari had been the Pelari Accords Council delegate for 9 years. She was the third in a line of Pelari delegates stretching back to the vote that had exiled humanity, the line that had cast the only dissenting vote that day, and had been quietly paying for that dissent ever since. The Pelari Accord was a small species. Their single inhabited world was resource poor, their fleet was token, and their influence in council chambers was proportional to both. They had learned to be careful. They had learned to wait. When news of the Orith corridor reached the smaller species, the first wave was fear. 400 ships had attacked and been largely destroyed in under 12 hours. That was a fact, and facts had a way of rearranging what people thought was possible. The second wave, arriving quietly in private channels, in conversations that were carefully not recorded, was something else. It sounded, if you listened closely enough, like relief. Reith Pelari received the first contact 3 days after the battle. It came from her counterpart in the Morin collective, a species of soft-spoken aquatic beings who had been subject to a long-standing Veth trade restriction that prevented them from accessing 11 of their own ancestral star systems. The message was brief. It said, "Are you watching?" She replied. "I am watching." That was all, but it was a beginning. The emergency council session that followed the Orith corridor should have been unified. It was not. The elder races pushed for a second enforcement action, larger, with full council backing. 8 of the 32 smaller species declined to commit forces. 3 of them offered no explanation. 5 of them cited with careful precision the same Article 1, Clause 3 that the human fleet had cited. The elder races noted the citations with the expression of people watching something unfamiliar happen and not yet certain how to name it. Then the Terran ambassador arrived. Her name was Kofi Aseros, a diplomat, not a soldier, and the 3rd member of the Osai family to stand in council chambers. He was 58 years old, unhurried in his movements, and carried nothing except a single data chip. He had not been invited. Council security had intercepted him at the chamber entrance and debated for 20 minutes whether to admit him. In the end, they had admitted him because no existing council regulation technically prevented a representative of a legally recognized spacefaring civilization from attending a session, and the human lawyers who had sent him had been very careful about that. He walked to the floor without waiting to be announced. He inserted the data chip into the chamber's public display terminal, which, again, all delegates were technically permitted to do, and he began to read aloud. What he read was the original exile verdict, in full, in the council's own archival language. Then he read, one by one, 47 documented instances of council member species violating their own charter over the past 2 centuries. Trade embargoes imposed on non-voting species without arbitration, military actions taken without full council vote, resource claims filed on systems that the charter designated as open access. It took him 31 minutes. The chamber was silent throughout. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of people realizing they are being recorded and that the recording will outlast the room. When he finished, he removed his data chip. "We have no further business today," he said. Then he walked out. In the corridor outside, Reith Pelari of the Pelari Accord was waiting. She had been watching through the chamber's public feed. When Kofi Aseros passed her, she reached out and touched his arm briefly with one of her 6 small hands. He stopped. They looked at each other. No words were necessary. The vote her ancestor had cast 200 years ago had just, at long last, been answered. The document arrived at the council's formal reception office on a Tuesday morning, or what passed for Tuesday morning in the council's standardized timekeeping, delivered by a human courier who handed it to the duty registrar with a polite nod and left without speaking. It was not encrypted. It was not marked urgent. It bore, on its cover page, the seal of the Terran Compact and a title, Proposed Charter of the Galactic Compact of Free Species, Draft for Consideration. High Arbiter Sareth III read it in one sitting. When he finished, he sat very still for a while, and then he called his senior advisors and they read it, and then they sat very still for a while too. The document was 47 pages long. It was, in the considered opinion of every legal scholar who later examined it, one of the most carefully constructed diplomatic instruments in recorded galactic history. Not because it was aggressive, it was not. Not because it made impossible demands, it did not. It was remarkable because it was fair. Genuinely, structurally, mathematically fair, in a way that the existing council charter had never been and had never tried to be. Every species, regardless of age, received equal standing. The species rank system was abolished. Arbitration panels would be selected by lottery from all member species, not appointed by the elder races. Military action required a 2/3 supermajority, including at least half of the non-elder species votes. Open access systems were legally defined and enforceable, and every exile decree issued in the past 500 years was subject to immediate review. There was a deadline. It was printed at the bottom of the last page. in the calm, administrative font of people who write deadlines as if they are weather. 30 days from receipt. A signature from a quorum of currently recognized spacefaring civilizations, including at least 6 of the 11 elder races, would bring the new charter into force and dissolve the existing council structure into a transitional body. Fleet Admiral Dale Osai, at the time of the document's delivery, had parked the Terran Compact's fleet in a holding position at the edge of council core space, not threatening, not retreating, simply present. She had spent the past 2 weeks conducting what her logs described as diplomatic readiness operations, which mostly consisted of receiving a steady stream of small species delegates aboard her flagship and having very long, very quiet conversations over tea. The Morin Collective came. The Pelari Accord came. The Geneth Confederation, who had been subject to a Veth mining concession on their home system's asteroid belt for 300 years, came and stayed for 2 days. By the time the 30-day deadline appeared on the Council's calendar, 7 of the 32 non-elder species had already signed the new charter in private. They had not announced it publicly. They were waiting, with the patience of people who had learned patience the hard way, to see which way the room turned. The elder races met in closed session for 6 of those 30 days. The debates were, by all accounts, fierce. The Veth hegemony argued for a military solution to the last, and was told, with exhausted bluntness by the Sorrel Dominion's first minister, that there was no military solution, that the numbers had been run, and that the numbers said no. The Kreth Collective's internal polling showed that 20% of their own species supported the new charter. The elder races were not a monolith. They never had been, and the stress of the past weeks had made that visible in ways it usually was not. On day 29, 3 elder species signed the charter. On day 30, 2 more did. That made 5. The 6th was the Pelari Accord, technically a non-elder species, but in the new charter's framework, the distinction no longer mattered. They signed at midnight with a delegation of exactly 1, Reith Pelari herself, who had been waiting outside the registry office for 4 hours with a stylus she had brought from home. The quorum was met. The charter was in force. Admiral Os received the confirmation on her bridge at 12 Standard Time. She read it twice. Then she told her crew to stand down from readiness posture and get some rest. They had been at their stations for 30 days. They deserved it. Then she went to her private cabin, took the old portrait of Mara Osai from the wall where she'd kept it for 11 years of service, and set it on her desk where she could see it properly. The first session of the Galactic Compact of Free Species was held on a world called Vareth Prime, in the same chamber where humanity had been exiled 212 years before. This was not accidental. The Terran Compact had requested it specifically, and every species involved had understood why. Rooms have memory. Sometimes it is useful to make them remember something new. The chamber had been renovated for the occasion, not dramatically, not expensively, but with care. The expulsion column on the carved ceiling had been filled in. All 11 names, including humanity's, were gone. In their place was a single line of text in the Compact's new common script, which had been developed by a team of linguists from 14 species in the 30 days since the charter was signed. No species is sovereign over another. It was Mara Osai's words, almost exactly. Nobody had asked permission to use them. Nobody had needed to. The first order of business was the election of the Compact chair, the presiding officer who would guide the new body's early sessions. The Terran Compact had been nominated by 12 different species, in 12 separate and apparently uncoordinated communications, none of which had been solicited. Fleet Admiral Dale Osai, present as a military observer, declined the nomination on behalf of her government before the session formally opened. The Terran Compact, she said, was a member of the Compact of Free Species, not its head. What it wanted was a seat and a vote, same as everyone else. The chair was elected from the Geneth Confederation, the species whose asteroid belt had been strip-mined under Veth concession for 3 centuries. Their delegate, an elderly scientist named Vor Geneth who had spent 40 years documenting the environmental damage to his home system, accepted the position with visible bewilderment and a speech that lasted 11 minutes, and ended with him sitting back down rather abruptly because he had run out of words. The chamber gave him the longest sustained acknowledgement anyone present had ever heard in a formal diplomatic session. In the weeks that followed, observers and analysts across dozens of species tried to name what had happened. Most of them reached for words like dominance, hegemony, empire. Some used the word revolution. None of those words were quite right, and the ones who thought hardest about it kept arriving at a different conclusion. What humanity had done was not conquer the galaxy. It had restructured the galaxy's understanding of itself. It had walked back into a room that had thrown it out and said, simply and with overwhelming evidence, "Your own rules were always better than your practice of them. Now live up to them." And the room had done it, not because humanity had forced it, but because enough people in the room had been waiting for a very long time for someone to make the argument out loud. The Terran Compact's delegation at the new Compact Hall was 12 people. 12, for a civilization of 9 billion across 13 star systems. When a journalist from the Morin Collective asked Fleet Admiral Os why the delegation was so small, she said, "Because we came here to participate, not to govern. If we wanted to govern, we wouldn't have needed a charter." On the outside wall of the new Compact Hall, above the entrance, a stonemason human, at the Compact's request, carved a single inscription. It was taken from the official record of the Grand Conclave, 212 years prior, from the speech that had been dismissed by 42 species and remembered by one. The final line of Mara Osai's address to the council that exiled her. "We will find our own way." Below it, added by the Pelari Accord's representative in the small ceremony held at the unveiling, was a second line. She had asked permission from the Osai family before adding it. They had said yes immediately, and one of them had cried, and they had asked her not to mention that, and she had agreed. The second line read, "They did." Somewhere in the galaxy, in a small system orbiting a dim orange star, a colony called Kepler's Rest had begun its 213th year of existence. Its people planted fields, raised children, repaired ships, and argued about the same things people have always argued about. They had done all of this during the silence, and they were doing it still. The galaxy had changed around them. They had in some fundamental way changed with it, and also remained entirely, stubbornly, beautifully themselves. That, more than the fleet or the charter or the physics, was probably the thing the council had never understood. You could exile a species. You could not exile what it was made of.